So today I want to talk about an app I talk about a fair bit on the channel, which is Logic Pro on iPad Pro. But unlike most of my videos, this is not going to be a video gushing about how awesome it is, which it is, but it is instead going to talk about the 5 things I don't like about Logic Pro on iPad Pro and things that I hope change over time. And they're not really in a specific order. They're all kind of equally important, but I suppose there are some I care about more than others, so I'll try to flag those as they come up. I have my list here on my iPad, a very multifunctional device. So the first issue is that there's no MIDI mapping, to my knowledge. Please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but so far I've not seen a way to map functionality of the synths or the interface to a MIDI keyboard, which is pretty different from most DAWs and plenty of other iPad apps as well. But I have not found an easy way to map MIDI to the interface. If I'm missing something, please let me know in the comments, but I've seen that called out by other people, so I think that's still the case as of mid-January 2024. So the second thing I dislike is the interface for loading in plugins in Logic on iPad. Now, if you're loading an Apple sound, it's actually pretty solid, pretty smooth. There's a lot of options, and they have a really great filtering system. That panel for instrument patches on the left is very clear. It looks like this. And this is fine. You can load Alchemy, RetroSynth, Sampler, Sample Alchemy, a bunch of different options, and I'm actually really grateful for how many options they brought over from Logic on Mac. But where the app really struggles is loading third-party plugins. It's actually difficult enough that you might not realize it's possible. I've definitely shown how to do this in other videos, but you hit plus, MIDI, hit the instrument knob icon, hit plus instrument, scroll down, audio units, instruments, and now you're seeing a list of the instrument manufacturers, which you then have to click into again. So it's a Korg, like we talked about last week. All the gadgets are now audio units, or most of the gadgets. And now I'm seeing all of Korg's plugins. This to me is too clunky. There's got to be a better way to do it. And I would like them to make it simpler, like integrate these plugins into the same panel or something else. But yeah, right now, I would say at least just list all of the apps without us having to go through that step of the manufacturer. I get that it's organized, but I don't really think about my plugins based on who made them. Although it's good to keep in mind, shout out to who makes the plugins. It's just not really like a quick way to get to my plugins, I guess. And it's not really how I've seen other apps like AUM do this. Just give me an alphabetical list of all the plugins. The next thing I'd like to see change and that I don't like about Logic on the iPad is the lack of third-party support compared to Mac Logic. So I've talked about this before, but because Logic Pro on iPad is really like a from the ground up, beefed up version of GarageBand on iPad and not a direct conversion of Logic on Mac, it is missing some features. It is way more intuitive. It's touch friendly. There's a bunch of pros for sure. And I'm glad they did what they did. But it also has the cons of not supporting the same kinds of plugins that are on Mac. Now that the iPad and the Mac have shared similar internal hardware for a very long time, specifically their systems on a chip, the M1 series of processors, at least in the iPad Pro and the iPad Air, it feels like we're long overdue for some sort of automatic Rosetta style conversion process for bringing some of these audio units over from manufacturers like Native Instruments or Arturia or Korg with some of their more pro level plugins that aren't on iPad, or Valhalla, there's many. Or those developers should find ways to create universal app versions of their plugins that work on both Mac and iPads running on the same processors. Especially for instrument plugins and even effect plugins, even if they were just to allow using the finger for touch to emulate a mouse and allowing for MIDI mapping and controlling with a MIDI controller or the built-in controllers on Logic for iPad, the touch surfaces or play surfaces, I think they call them. That would be a huge improvement. Obviously, there are maybe storage concerns for some of those plugins, but that's also true on your base model Macs. And this iPad has 1 terabyte of storage, and you can get one with 2 terabytes. So it could handle big, complex contact libraries, hypothetically. With 16 gigs of RAM, the M2 processor, which is available in a MacBook Pro and a MacBook Air, which can definitely run these same plugins, I would like to see more third-party support brought to Logic. And this would kind of be universal, right? This would be third-party support on iPad. They don't have to be locked into Logic, but having access to the Arturia V collection, to Native Instruments Complete collection. That would really change some of what I can and can't do. And as much as I don't like Waves as a company sometimes, their Waves 2 real-time pitch correction is a really good plugin I also would love to have on here. The fourth thing that I don't like about Logic on iPad is the lack of controller support from devices that support desktop Logic. So like I just said, because Logic on iPad is not a direct conversion, but is kind of a rebuild, it breaks the compatibility layer that existed for controllers like Native Instruments, some of the Novation controllers. I have a Launchpad Pro, which should hypothetically allow me to trigger the clips in live loops. That doesn't work. All of the work that those developers put into their hardware to map their controllers natively to Logic does not work on the iPad version. So I would love to see updates to those controllers so that they can natively show you levels on the mixer or give you transport control, undo control, record control, that sort of thing. I'm hopeful we'll see it over time, but it probably depends on the adoption of Logic Pro and demand from consumers. So this is me asking, but hopefully other people are asking as well, because it would be really awesome. And it's honestly one of the things that makes Ableton my go-to DAW, is because so many of the controllers and devices I use natively support it and make it a cool combination of hardware and software. And like I said earlier, because there's no ability to MIDI map, as far as I'm aware, you can't really recreate this yourself either. But having native supported mapping from Native Instruments and Novation and other Arturia, other keyboard manufacturers, it would be really nice. It's one of the things I get asked about a lot in the comments on my Logic videos. How do I get my mapping working from my keyboard to Logic? And on iPad, that's not really a thing right now. And so whether it's native or MIDI mapping, 1 or 4, right? I would love to see that. And it's right now one of the bigger cons of Logic on iPad. And the last con, and for a lot of people, the deal-breaking biggest con, is that it's a subscription. So I've talked about this before, but I've never made a full video about it, and obviously this is not just about the subscription, it's about 4 other things, but talking about the subscription, I have come to really agree with people. I don't think music making apps are really good candidates for subscriptions. I don't think it's a bad idea to have it as an option. If people want to subscribe to any given app, and it's beneficial for the developer and for the consumer at a reasonable price, then I think it should be available. But as the only option, I don't think it works, because you're not going to be using that music app every day necessarily. Like maybe you do, maybe you only work out of one DAW and you always are making stuff every day, and maybe you make money from your songs and you have some sort of professional workflow where you're getting more money in than you're putting out. But for me, there are sometimes months I don't use Logic on iPad. I still pay the $5 because I know I'm going to want to go back to the projects I made, and it's relatively cheap, and I know I'm going to make videos about it. And those videos will probably get enough AdSense to hopefully cover that month's fee for Logic. But plugins, desktop software, if you see a universal direction and a universal shift towards everything being a subscription, then you're paying a continual fee, not just to upload your music to distributors so that they can be on Spotify, but also just to keep working on the projects you are already working on. If you aren't immediately finishing a song as soon as you start it and then printing it to audio, you have to keep paying for plugins to have access to the tools you were using while you were working on that song. For people using single purchase DAWs with the built-in plugins and effects, you're fine. But for someone using a DAW like Ableton and then subscribing to a bunch of plugins like Roland and Native Instruments has a subscription, and Waves try to do a subscription, they might have a subscription. I think it's really easy to get way over the edge on plugin subscriptions, and DAW subscriptions, while different and potentially opening up a door for people, I think is the only option to access the DAW, it's not great. I think there should be a flat fee purchase option for Logic on iPad, even if it was like $200. Because I started thinking about this, like I have GarageBand projects from 2015, and I'm able to open those on GarageBand on iPad now, and I can open those same projects in Logic, which is really cool. It's a cool layer of continuity. But if I'd been paying a subscription for that whole time, it would have definitely exceeded, if it was the same price as Logic, it would have definitely exceeded $200 by now. And there's a future in which, well, it's only $5 a month right now, 4, 5, 6 years down the line, you could have ended up paying more for a single license of Logic on iPad than you would for Logic on desktop, for Ableton, as long as you're not upgrading every cycle. I think the long-term trajectory of subscription only is not great for music apps. And you can make the argument for other apps. I'm not gonna make this video that broad, but for music apps especially, I just think there's no way to buy it on sale, like unless I guess they did some kind of sale subscription window, but then that would only be temporary. There are pros in the sense that if this was any other company, they might be struggling for cash, and so having recurring revenue, especially on the iPad where people don't pay as much for plugins or for any audio apps in general, you could see the benefit of a continued recurring revenue model, which we sometimes see with developers asking for a paid upgrade version, which actually seems pretty fair to me, especially if your app works no matter what, and they're just paying for new features, they're asking for money for new features. Given how cheap a lot of these apps are, that seems fair to me. But locking people into a recurring subscription for a DAW, it's pretty rough. And the only thing that makes it even kind of okay to me is that it does feel like a pretty fair price for what you get right now. $5 a month or $50 a year for what you get is pretty solid, but I don't know. Like I said, it makes sense for a year, it makes sense for 2 years, but you start talking about 4, 5, 6, 10, and all of a sudden, you know, you could be paying $500 for 10 years of using Logic, which, I don't know, that seems weird. But if in those 10 years they've made it a substantially better app and continually listen to the users and add a bunch of support and keep making it better and better, maybe it's okay. But it's still, I think, probably the biggest con about Logic on iPad and the biggest thing pushing people away from it, which is really too bad because besides the subscription thing, I think it's the best app, the best music production app on iPad in my opinion. But with the subscription thing, anytime someone comments, oh, I refuse to get it because it's a subscription, all I can really say is like, I understand. That's totally fair. And I totally get that. So I hope Apple introduces a way to pay for it. Hopefully something in equivalent price range to Logic on Mac, which is $200. I think it's worth $200. I would pay $200 to have a locked license that was mine, that was upgraded. Because I mean, really, if I paid for Logic Pro on Mac, I want to say 2018, I got a student bundle, so it was like $300 for Logic, Final Cut, Motion, something else. I didn't really use anything except for Final Cut and Logic. But if I were to have just bought Logic for $200 in 2018, it's still been getting updates. It's still been getting tons of new features, and I've never paid for it again. So you could imagine a scenario where that would be true for the iPad version as well, if that's the route they had gone. But I can also see how if they'd launched Logic on iPad at $200, it would have scared a lot of people away. So I think having a subscription model is okay if there was a way to just buy it outright too. So if they kept the model they have, $5 a month, $50 a year, or 200 single purchase, adding a 200 single purchase, I think that would probably make it okay for me. But what do you think? Do any of these matter? Are there things missing that you want on here that I didn't talk about? Definitely let me know in the comments below. And thank you so much to everyone who's liked, subscribed, and listened to my music. It really means a lot to see this community keep growing. We're getting really close to 11,000 subscribers. It's insane. I appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you next week.